I'm Tiffany, 34 female. I live in a small, quiet apartment filled with books and the scent of old paper, a natural extension of my work as a historical archivist. My life has always been one of order and careful preservation, of finding stories in dusty records and giving them a voice. It was this quiet, unassuming life that my own family used against me, turning my sense of duty into a weapon to destroy the one person I swore to protect. They thought that because I was quiet, I was weak, and that because I was meticulous, I was naive. They were wrong on all counts, and their miscalculation would cost them everything. Before this story unfolds, I'd love to connect with you. Please let me know in the comments where you're watching from and what time it is in your corner of the world. It's amazing to see how far these stories can travel. It all began on a gray Sunday afternoon in my grandmother Agnes's living room. The air was thick with the scent of lavender potpourri and the unspoken tension that always seemed to accompany a family meeting. My grandmother, Agnes, sat in her favorite worn armchair, her hands, wrinkled and spotted with age, resting on the crocheted afghan that covered her knees. At 82, she was still sharp, but her body was failing her. A retired nurse who had spent 40 years caring for others, she was now the one in need of care, a reversal of roles that she found deeply frustrating. Her recent fall had been the catalyst for this gathering, a stark reminder that her independence was slipping away like sand through her fingers. My older brother, Richard, stood by the mantelpiece, striking a pose that I knew was meant to convey authority and control. At 42, he was a successful real estate investor, or at least that was the image he projected. He was dressed in a crisp polo shirt and expensive jeans, his watch glinting under the dim light of the lamp. His wife, Jessica, sat primly on the edge of the sofa, her phone strategically placed face down beside her. She was a lifestyle influencer, a profession that seemed to consist entirely of photographing her perfect life and posting it online with aspirational captions. They were a power couple, a unit of ambition and polished surfaces. And then there was me. I sat on the ottoman, feeling small and out of place, dressed in my usual simple sweater and slacks. I was the quiet one, the single one, the one who worked with history instead of building a future. "You need to be realistic," Richard began, his voice smooth and practiced. He paced the worn carpet, his hands clasped behind his back. "Mom can't live alone anymore, it's not safe." He glanced at Agnes, his expression a perfect mask of concern. Jessica nodded in solemn agreement, her manicured fingers tapping a gentle rhythm on her knee. "We've looked at some facilities," she chimed in, her voice soft and sympathetic. "But they're so impersonal, and the good ones are incredibly expensive. We want what's best for her, of course." Agnes sighed, her gaze fixed on a faded photograph of my late grandfather. "I don't want to go to a home," she said, her voice thin but firm. "I want to stay in my house." This was the moment they had been waiting for. Richard stopped pacing and turned to me, his eyes locking onto mine. "Tiff, we know how much you love Grandma," he said, his tone shifting from authoritative to deeply personal. "And we were thinking you're the best one to do this. You have the most flexible schedule. You don't have kids to worry about. You're organized, you're patient." The proposal hung in the air, heavy and suffocating. They wanted me to become her full-time caregiver. It was an enormous ask. My job at the city archives was my passion, my sanctuary. It required focus and long hours. But as I looked at my grandmother's worried face, her pride warring with her fear, my heart ached. I loved her more than anyone. She was the one who had encouraged my love of history, who had taught me to read, who had made my childhood feel safe and magical. I have my job, Richard," I stammered, feeling the walls of their trap closing in. "I can't just quit." "Of course not," Jessica said quickly, leaning forward with a reassuring smile. "We wouldn't ask you to, but you could reduce your hours, maybe go part-time. We'll handle everything else." Richard stepped forward, placing a hand on my shoulder. It felt heavy, proprietary. "Here's the plan," he said, all business now. "We'll set up a joint account with Grandma's funds, her pension, her savings. It's a substantial amount. She was always a careful saver. Jessica and I will manage all the bills, the groceries, the mortgage payments, all of it. We'll pay for a visiting nurse a few times a week to help with the heavy lifting. All you have to do, Tiff, is be here. You won't have to worry about a single dollar. We'll even give you a stipend for your time to make up for your lost income. It sounded so reasonable, so generous. They were painting a picture of a perfect family unit, each person playing their part. Richard and Jessica, the financial managers, handling the complex burden of money. Me, the loving granddaughter, providing the hands-on care. They presented it as a seamless, logical solution. The stipend was the final, clever touch. It made me feel like a valued part of the team, not just a free caregiver. It assuaged the part of me that was panicking about my own financial stability. They had an answer for everything. They praised my compassionate nature, my reliability, my unique position in the family to take on such a sacred trust. They made it sound like a calling, an honor. I looked at Agnes. A small, hopeful light had returned to her eyes. The thought of staying in her home, surrounded by her memories, with me by her side, was clearly a profound relief. How could I say no to that? How could I be the one to send her to a sterile, lonely room in a facility she dreaded? I felt the weight of her happiness, her safety, her entire world settling onto my shoulders. My brother and his wife weren't just asking, they were anointing me. It was a responsibility I felt I couldn't refuse without appearing selfish and uncaring. So, against the quiet, screaming voice of my own intuition, a voice I was far too practiced at ignoring, I agreed. I promised my grandmother I would protect her. I promised my brother I would trust him. And in that moment, in that quiet, lavender-scented room, I sealed our collective fates. I had no idea that the sacred trust I was accepting was nothing more than a key I was handing over to the wolves at the door. The first few months were a blur of exhaustion and adjustment. I reduced my hours at the archives to 3 days a week, a decision that felt like cutting off a limb. My work was my identity, and the quiet solitude of the records room was a stark contrast to the demanding, often chaotic reality of full-time caregiving. Agnes's needs were constant. There were medications to manage, meals to prepare, appointments to get to. There were good days, filled with shared stories and quiet companionship, but there were also terrible days, when her pain was sharp and her frustration boiled over into anger. I was perpetually tired, my own life shrinking until it was contained within the 4 walls of my grandmother's house. I rarely saw my friends, and my quiet apartment gathered dust. Richard and Jessica, true to their word in the beginning, seemed to handle the financial side of things. They would swing by once a week, usually on a Sunday evening. Their visits were always brief and filled with a performative flurry of activity. Jessica would arrive with a small bouquet of overpriced flowers, placing them in a vase with a dramatic sigh about how busy her week had been. Richard would stride in, clapping me on the shoulder and asking, "How's our star caregiver?" Before heading straight to the small desk in the corner of the living room where Agnes kept her checkbook and mail. He'd sit there for 20 minutes, shuffling papers, writing checks, and sealing envelopes. "Just paying the bills, Tiff," he'd say breezily if I walked by. "Property tax, utilities, the visiting nurse, you wouldn't believe the paperwork." I was so consumed with the physical and emotional labor of caring for Agnes that I was grateful to be spared the mental load of finances. I trusted them. Richard was my brother. He was family. The thought that he would do anything untoward didn't even cross my mind. It was an impossible, unthinkable concept. So I'd nod, thank him, and go back to helping Agnes with her dinner. They never stayed long. After the bills were handled, they'd give Agnes a kiss on the cheek, tell me to call if I needed anything, though they rarely answered when I did, and sweep out of the house, leaving a trail of expensive perfume and a feeling of unsettling emptiness in their wake. Slowly, I began to notice small things, tiny dissonances that pricked at the edge of my consciousness. Jessica, whose influencer career had seemed to be stagnating, suddenly had a new designer handbag in every photo she posted. One week it was a Chanel, the next a Birkin. When I casually mentioned it, she laughed it off. "Oh, this old thing? It's a knockoff, darling. For the brand aesthetic, you know." But it didn't look like a knockoff. Then Richard started driving a new car, a sleek, black luxury SUV that cost more than my annual salary. He claimed he got an incredible deal through a client, a classic salesman's line. One evening, while they were over, I overheard them talking in hushed tones in the hallway. I only caught a few words. Richard said something about a high-risk, high-reward investment, and Jessica replied, "Are you sure? We can't afford any more mistakes." Richard shushed her, and they quickly changed the subject when they saw me approach. I told myself I was being paranoid, that their finances were none of my business. They were successful Apple, this was just how their world worked. My world of dusty books and fixed salaries was different, and I shouldn't judge. The real turning point came about 6 months in. Agnes had another fall, more serious this time. The doctor was blunt. She needed 24/7 professional care. She couldn't stay at home anymore, not even with me. The news was devastating for both of us. Agnes wept, and I felt a profound sense of failure, as if I had broken my promise to her. Richard and Jessica swooped in again, this time with brochures for a place called Maple Creek Senior Living. It looked beautiful, more like a resort than a nursing home, with landscaped gardens and a welcoming lobby. "It's the best, Tiff," Richard said, his arm around my shoulders. "Only the best for Grandma. It's expensive, but she can afford it. Her savings are meant for this, for her comfort and safety in her final years." His confidence was reassuring. He showed me a spreadsheet on his laptop, a confusing jumble of numbers that he claimed was a projection of Agnes's finances. He pointed to a bottom line that seemed to indicate she had more than enough to cover the hefty monthly fee for several years. I didn't understand the details, but I trusted the conclusion. We all sat with Agnes and sold her on the idea, emphasizing the social activities, the professional medical staff, the beautiful dining room. Reluctantly, she agreed. The day we moved her in was one of the hardest of my life. I packed her memories into boxes, and as I left her in her new, sterile room, I felt a grief so deep it was physical. Richard handled all the paperwork with the facility's admissions office, writing out the first large check from Agnes's account with a flourish. "All taken care of," he said, patting my back. "You did a good job, Tiff. Now you can get your own life back." But as I drove away from Maple Creek, I didn't feel relief. I felt a cold, creeping dread that I simply couldn't explain. With Agnes settled at Maple Creek, a strange and unsettling quiet descended upon my life. I went back to working full-time at the archives, seeking refuge in the familiar silence and the scent of aging paper. The building's thick stone walls felt like a fortress, insulating me from a world that had become complicated and sad. My grandmother's house, which had been the center of my universe for half a year, now stood empty. Richard had hired a company to clear it out, saying it was best to sell it quickly before the market turned. He promised the proceeds would go directly into Agnes's care fund, to keep it healthy for the long term. Every decision he made sounded so practical, so responsible. I visited Agnes every other day. She was slowly adjusting, but there was a persistent sadness in her eyes that I couldn't erase. She missed her home, her garden, her memories. I would sit with her for hours, reading to her and listening to her stories, trying to be the one constant, reassuring presence in her shrinking world. During these visits, I'd sometimes ask about Richard and Jessica, but she'd just shake her head. "They call sometimes," she'd say, "always in a hurry." They rarely visited in person, always citing a business trip, a client dinner, or a brand collaboration that couldn't be rescheduled. Their absence felt like another small tear in the fabric of our family, but I told myself they were just busy. They were handling the important, stressful financial side of things, so I could be the one to provide emotional support. We all had our roles. The illusion shattered on a Tuesday afternoon. I was in the archive's basement, carefully cataloging a collection of Civil War-era letters, my mind completely absorbed in the delicate cursive of a soldier writing home to his family. My phone buzzed in my pocket, an unwelcome intrusion. I ignored it, but it buzzed again, and then a third time. Annoyed, I pulled it out. The caller ID read Maple Creek Senior Living. A knot of ice formed in my stomach. My first thought was that something had happened to Agnes. My hand was trembling as I answered. "Hello, Tiffany." The voice on the other end was female, clipped, and devoid of warmth. I recognized it as Ms. Albright, the facility's business administrator. "Yes, this is she. Is my grandmother okay?" I asked, my voice tight with panic. Your grandmother is fine, she replied coolly. I'm not calling about a medical issue, I'm calling about a financial one. The ice in my stomach spread to my chest. Financial? What do you mean? My brother, Richard, handles all of her payments. There was a short, sharp sigh on the other end of the line. Yes, he does, or rather, he is supposed to. The check he submitted for this month's payment, which was due on the 1st, was returned by the bank this morning. I felt a wave of dizziness, and I had to lean against a shelving unit to steady myself. Returned? You mean it bounced? That's impossible, I said, my voice barely a whisper. There must be some ND of mistake, a clerical error at the bank. My grandmother has significant savings. Ms. Albright's tone became even colder, if that was possible. Ms., we are a business. We do not make mistakes of this nature. The check was returned for insufficient funds. This is the second time this has happened. The check for last month was also delayed, and Mr. only rectified the payment after several phone calls. I was stunned into silence. The second time, Richard had never mentioned any issues. I don't understand, I stammered. He never said anything to me. That may be, Ms. Albright said, her lack of sympathy palpable. However, the fact remains that your grandmother's account is now past due by a significant amount. According to the contract your brother signed, you are listed as the secondary responsible party. If payment is not rendered in full within 10 business days, we will be forced to begin discharge proceedings. Discharge proceedings. The phrase echoed in the silent basement, a death knell for my grandmother's safety and my own peace of mind. They were going to kick her out. My 82-year-old, frail grandmother would be homeless because a check bounced. The shame was immediate and overwhelming, a hot flush that crawled up my neck. I felt personally responsible, as if I had failed in my most fundamental duty. I'll fix this, I said, trying to inject a confidence I didn't feel into my voice. I'll call my brother right now. I'll come down there myself with a cashier's check. Please, just don't do anything yet. You have 10 business days, she repeated, and then the line went dead. I stood there for a long moment, the phone still pressed to my ear, listening to the dial tone. My mind was racing, trying to find a logical explanation. Maybe it was a simple mistake. Maybe Richard had transferred money to the wrong account. Maybe the sale of the house hadn't closed yet. There had to be a reason. I immediately dialed Richard's number. It went straight to voicemail. Richard, it's Tiffany. Call me back immediately. It's an emergency regarding Grandma. My voice was shaky, bordering on hysterical. I tried Jessica. Her phone was off. I texted them both, my thumbs flying across the screen. Maple Creek called. The check bounced. They are threatening to discharge Grandma. Call me now. I left work in a daze, my colleagues' concerned questions fading into a meaningless buzz. I drove straight to my bank and pulled out every cent I had in my emergency savings, a little over $5,000. It wasn't nearly enough to cover the past due amount, but it was something. It was a gesture of good faith. All the while, I kept calling Richard and Jessica. Voicemail, phone off. The silence from them was no longer just the background noise of their busy lives. It was deafening. It was an answer in itself. As I drove toward Maple Creek with a uselessly small bank check in my purse, the simple, logical explanations began to evaporate, replaced by a dark and terrifying suspicion that felt like a monster awakening in the pit of my stomach. The shame I felt was slowly being eclipsed by a cold, rising tide of fury. This wasn't a mistake. This was something else entirely. The meeting with Ms. Albright was as humiliating as I had feared. I sat in her sterile office, the smell of antiseptic cleaner hanging in the air, and explained that there must have been a terrible mix-up. I offered her my small cashier's check as a down payment, a promise that the rest was coming. She accepted it with a look that was a mixture of pity and disdain, and reiterated that the 10-day clock was still ticking. I left Maple Creek feeling hollowed out, the weight of the situation pressing down on me so hard I could barely breathe. My frantic calls and texts to Richard and Jessica continued to go unanswered. Their silence was a confession, and I knew I could no longer wait for them to provide an explanation. I had to find one myself. The next morning, I went to see my grandmother. I didn't tell her about the bounced check. The stress would be too much for her. Instead, I told her a carefully constructed lie. I said the bank required some updated signatures for her accounts, and that for me to help manage things while Richard was traveling for work. I needed her to sign a limited power of attorney form. My hands shook as I held the pen for her. Deceiving her felt like a betrayal in itself, but I knew it was the only way to get the access I needed to protect her. She trusted me implicitly, signing the document without a second thought. That trust was a knife in my gut. With the notarized power of attorney in hand, I went directly to her bank. The branch manager, a kind-looking man named Mr. Harrison, led me to his office. I explained the situation calmly and professionally, just as I would when handling a delicate historical document. I told him I was concerned about potential fraud on my elderly grandmother's account and need Ed to review her statements for the past year. He was sympathetic and efficient. A few clicks of his mouse and he was printing out a thick stack of papers. "Here you are," he said, handing them to me. "Everything from the last 12 months. I took the stack to an empty table in the corner of my apartment and spread them out. It was a chilly afternoon, but I didn't notice. For the next 5 hours, I sat there, tracing the story of a catastrophic betrayal, one transaction at a time. The first few months looked normal. Her pension was deposited, and checks were written for her mortgage, utilities, and groceries. But then, about a week after I had agreed to be her caregiver, the pattern changed. It started small. A check made out to cash for $500. A few days later, another for $1,000. Then came the debit card transactions. Purchases from high-end department stores I knew Jessica frequented. A charge from a ridiculously expensive restaurant where Richard had posted a picture of himself on social media just last month. As I moved through the months, the withdrawals grew bolder. Large sums of money were transferred to an account I didn't recognize. A quick search of the account number online revealed it belonged to R&J Holdings, LLC, Richard and Jessica. They had created a shell company. Thousands of dollars, then tens of thousands, were siphoned from my grandmother's life savings into their sham corporation. I saw a payment to a luxury car dealership, matching the exact month Richard got his new SUV. I saw multiple charges from a travel agency, corresponding to the business trips that had kept them from visiting their own mother. I saw the deposit from the sale of her house, a huge sum of money that should have secured her care for the rest of her life. It had been in her account for less than 24 hours before it was transferred, in its entirety, to R&J Holdings. And then it was gone. The final statements were the most devastating. The account, which should have held hundreds of thousands of dollars, was nearly empty. There were overdraft fees, small, desperate deposits of a few $100s, likely from Richard, trying to keep the account barely afloat, followed by the bounced check to Maple Creek. They had drained it all. They had bled her dry, down to the very last cent, and then they had walked away. The paper trail wasn't just about greed, it was about contempt. They had spent my grandmother's security on handbags, fancy dinners, and risky investments, all while I was down the hall, changing her sheets and making her tea. My sacrifice had been the cover for their crime. My trust had been the key that unlocked the vault. I sat there amidst the damning evidence, the black and white proof of their cruelty, and I felt nothing but a cold, hard clarity. The panic and shame were gone, burned away by a white-hot rage that was terrifying in its intensity. This wasn't just a family dispute. This was elder fraud. This was a criminal act. But I knew that going to the police with a pile of bank statements and a story about my brother would be a slow, bureaucratic nightmare. They might not take it seriously. It could get bogged down in a he said, she said family drama. I needed more. I needed an expert. I needed someone who could turn this paper trail into an ironclad case. My mind, trained to organize information and find the right resource, went to work. I spent the rest of the evening online, searching for forensic accountants specializing in elder financial abuse. That's when I found her name, Ms. Evelyn Reed. Her website described her as a former federal investigator with a private practice dedicated to uncovering financial crimes. Her motto was simple: the numbers don't lie. I picked up the phone and made an appointment for the next day. The quiet, unassuming archivist was gone. In her place was a woman with a singular, unyielding purpose: to get justice for Agnes, no matter the cost. My meeting with Ms. Evelyn Reed took place in a sterile, nondescript office building that smelled of stale coffee and ambition. Ms. Reed herself was the opposite of her surroundings. She was a woman in her mid-50s with sharp, intelligent eyes that seemed to see right through me. She wore a perfectly tailored gray suit and had an air of calm, unshakable competence. There was no sympathy in her expression, only focus. She didn't offer me tea or platitudes. She just gestured to the chair opposite her desk and said, "Show me what you have." I laid out the bank statements on her wide mahogany desk, my meticulously placed sticky notes marking the most egregious transactions. I explained the timeline, the promises my brother had made, the facade he and his wife had maintained. I spoke in a low, steady voice, the voice I used at the archives when presenting my findings. I pushed all the emotion down, converting my rage into cold, hard data. She listened without interruption, her gaze flicking from the papers to my face and back again. She absorbed every detail, her mind clearly working several steps ahead of my story. When I finished, she leaned back in her chair and steepled her fingers, her expression unreadable. "This is blatant," she said, her voice crisp. "It's a classic case of fiduciary abuse. They gained your trust and the trust of your grandmother to get control of her assets, and then they liquidated them for personal enrichment. The Shell Corporation is a common, almost amateurish attempt to hide the money trail." She picked up a statement showing the transfer of the house sale proceeds. "This here," she said, tapping the paper with a long, elegant finger, "is the felony charge, grand larceny. The amount is high enough that they'll be facing serious prison time, not just a slap on the wrist." Hearing her say it so clinically, so definitively, was both terrifying and validating. This was real. I wasn't just an angry sister, I was the witness to a major crime. "What do we do now?" I asked, my voice barely a whisper. "The police." "We'll get to them," she said, waving a dismissive hand. "But we don't go to them with just this. We go to them with a case so perfectly packaged they can't possibly ignore it or slow-walk it. We need to connect every single dollar they stole to a specific personal purchase or failed investment. We need to build a fortress of evidence." For the next 2 weeks, that's exactly what we did. Under Ms. Reed's guidance, I became an investigator in my own family's downfall. My skills as an archivist proved invaluable. I was methodical, patient, and relentless. We subpoenaed records from the credit card companies Richard and Jessica used. We cross-referenced the charges with their social media accounts. Jessica, in her endless quest for online validation, had been our most valuable asset. There she was, posting a photo of herself at a 5-star resort in Hawaii, geotagged and time-stamped. On the exact day, a $15,000 charge from that same resort appeared on Agnes's account. There was Richard, posing proudly next to his new SUV in front of their house, the day after a wire transfer was made to the dealership. They had documented their own crimes with hashtags and filters. The most sickening discovery came when Ms. Reed's investigation dug into Richard's real estate business. It turned out he wasn't the successful investor he pretended to be. He was deeply in debt. His last few projects had been catastrophic failures. He had used my grandmother's money not just for a lavish lifestyle, but as a desperate, last-ditch effort to save his failing business. He had thrown her life savings into a high-risk commercial development project that had collapsed, taking all the money with it. He hadn't just been greedy, he had been reckless, gambling my grandmother's security on a long shot, and he had lost everything. While Ms. Reed compiled the financial evidence, I handled the human side. I obtained a more comprehensive power of attorney from Agnes, this time explaining that a serious financial issue had arisen that I needed to handle on her behalf. The trust in her eyes was almost unbearable. I also made a difficult choice. I went to the bank, and using the last of my own money and a high-interest cash advance from my credit card, I paid the outstanding balance at Maple Creek. It wiped me out financially, but it bought me time, and more importantly, it ensured my grandmother was safe. Her care was my primary responsibility, and I would not fail her again. Finally, after 3 weeks of intense work, it was all done. Ms. Reed had prepared a thick binder, a detailed, damning narrative of Richard and Jessica's crimes. It contained bank statements, credit card bills, social media printouts, corporate filings for their shell company, and a clear, concise report that laid out the chronology of the theft in irrefutable detail. "This is ready for the district attorney's office," she said, patting the binder. "We also have everything we need for a civil suit to freeze their assets and attempt to claw back whatever is left." But I knew I needed to do one more thing before I handed it over to the justice system. I couldn't let them be arrested by strangers without ever having to face me. They owed me an explanation. They owed me the dignity of a confrontation. They needed to see my face and understand the full scope of what they had done, not from a prosecutor, but from the sister they had so casually betrayed. I called Richard. This time, surprisingly, he answered. I told him there was a family emergency regarding Grandma's estate and that we needed to meet immediately, in person, at my apartment. He agreed, his voice laced with an arrogant annoyance, completely oblivious to the storm that was about to break over his head. The stage was set. The evidence was gathered. The quiet archivist was ready for the final act. My apartment had never felt so small or so charged with energy. It was a Thursday evening, before Richard and Jessica were due to arrive. The thick binder of evidence Ms. Reed had prepared sat on my coffee table, a dark monument to their sins. Beside it, I had carefully arranged a selection of exhibits, like a museum curator displaying the artifacts of a dead civilization. There was a large, glossy print of Jessica posing with her new handbag, the price tag from the store's website printed beneath it. There was a photo of Richard's new SUV, next to the bank statement showing the payment. And in the center of it all was a framed picture of our grandmother, smiling, from a time before her health had failed, a time before her own children had decided she was worth more as a source of funds than as a human being. I was surprisingly calm. The rage that had fueled me for weeks had cooled into something harder and more precise, resolve. There was no room for doubt or hesitation. I knew my facts, I had my evidence, and I had the moral high ground. This wasn't going to be a shouting match. It was going to be an execution. The doorbell rang at exactly 7:00 p.m. I took a deep breath and opened it. Richard and Jessica stood there, looking impatient. Richard was already talking before he was fully inside. "Okay, Tiff, what's this all about? I had to cancel a dinner with a potential investor for this." Jessica swept past me, looking around my modest apartment with a faint sneer. "Is everything all right with Agnes?" she asked, the concern in her voice as fake as the designer logo on her purse. "Agnes is fine," I said, closing the door behind them. The click of the lock sounded unusually final. "Please, have a seat." They sat on my small sofa, Richard looking at his watch, Jessica pulling out her phone. They hadn't even noticed the display on the coffee table. "This meeting isn't about Grandma's health," I began, my voice even and low. "It's about her money, or rather, the lack of it." That got their attention. Richard put his phone down. Jessica looked up from her screen. "What are you talking about?" Richard asked, a hint of irritation in his voice. "Her finances are fine, a little tight maybe, but we're managing it." I gave a small, humorless smile. "No, you're not," I said. I reached down and picked up the binder, placing it on the sofa between them. "You're not managing it because it's gone, all of it." I opened the binder to the first page, a summary sheet Ms. Reed had prepared, showing the total amount stolen, just over $450,000. Richard stared at the number, his face paling slightly. Jessica's eyes widened, but she quickly composed herself. "This is ridiculous," she scoffed. "What is this?" "This," I said, gesturing to the binder and the items on the table, "is the product of a 3-week investigation into where our grandmother's life savings went. This is a forensic accounting report." I then began, in a calm, methodical voice, to walk them through their crimes. I started with the small cash withdrawals. I moved on to the credit card statements, holding up the picture of Jessica's purse. "This handbag, Jessica, it cost $6,000. It was paid for from Agnes's checking account on October 14th. You posted this picture on the 15th with the caption, 'Hard work pays off.' Whose hard work were you referring to?" Mine, while I was cleaning up after our sick grandmother, or Agnes S. from the 40 years she worked as a nurse. Jessica's face went from pale to a blotchy red. She opened her mouth to speak, but no words came out. I turned to Richard. And this SUV, Richard, a beautiful car, it must have been a great deal, just like you said. Especially since the $25,000 down payment was wired directly from Agnes's account the day after you sold her house. Richard stood up abruptly. Now, you listen to me, he started, his voice rising, trying to regain control through intimidation. You don't know what you're talking about. I was investing her money. It was for her own good to make it grow. Invest it, I shot back, my own voice rising for the first time. You call a bankrupt commercial real estate venture an investment. You call paying off your business debts and funding your wife's fantasy lifestyle an investment strategy. Ms. Reed, my accountant, calls it felony grand larceny and elder financial abuse. The name, Ms. Reed, and the legal terms made them both flinch. The reality of their situation was finally starting to dawn on them. Their blustering and denial began to crumble, replaced by a raw, ugly panic. Jessica started to cry, not tears of remorse, but tears of self-pity. We were going to pay it back, she sobbed. We just needed a little help to get through a rough patch. When? I demanded, my voice like ice. When were you going to pay it back? After the check for her nursing home bounced and she was thrown out onto the street? Did you have a plan for that too? The finality in my tone silenced them. They just stared at me, two cornered animals, their polished facades stripped away to reveal the selfish, rotten core beneath. Richard finally slumped back onto the sofa, his arrogance completely gone, replaced by the hollow look of a defeated man. What do you want, Tiffany? He asked, his voice a hoarse whisper. Money? I don't have it. It's gone. I looked at him, my own brother, and felt nothing. No pity, no lingering affection, just a vast, empty space where my love for him used to be. I don't want your money, I said quietly. You don't have any. You have Agnes's money, and the state will get that back for her. What I wanted was for you to sit here, in my home, and look me in the eye as I told you exactly what you are. I let that hang in the air for a moment before delivering the final blow. Ms. Reed filed her complete report with the district attorney's office this afternoon, I said, watching the last bit of color drain from their faces. She also filed a civil suit this morning, and a judge has already approved a temporary order to freeze all your known assets, including your house, your cars, and the R&J Holdings account. A detective will likely be contacting you within the next 24 hours. I wanted you to hear it from me first. They sat in stunned, absolute silence. There was nothing left to say. I had taken their story, the one where they were the smart, successful ones, and I was the naive little sister, and I had archived it forever under the heading of crime. I pointed to the door. Now get out of my apartment. The aftermath was not a swift, clean victory, but a long, grinding war of attrition. Just as I had predicted, Richard and Jessica were contacted by detectives the very next day. Their arrests were quiet, without the dramatic flair of a television show. There were no flashing lights or SWAT teams, just a quiet knock on their door and the cold, unyielding process of the justice system taking over. Their perfect, curated life imploded overnight. The news spread through our extended family like a virus, creating shockwaves of disbelief, gossip, and division. Some relatives called me a hero. Others accused me of being vindictive, of destroying the family over a misunderstanding about money. They couldn't or wouldn't see the calculated cruelty for what it was. I learned quickly that the idea of family is often more important to people than the reality of it. The legal battle was emotionally and financially draining. Even with the mountain of evidence Ms. Reed had provided, the court proceedings were slow and agonizing. Richard and Jessica's defense attorney tried to paint me as a bitter, jealous sister who had manipulated an elderly woman with dementia to turn against her loving son. They claimed the money had been a gift, a loan, an investment gone wrong, anything but the theft it so clearly was. I had to take the stand and testify against my own brother. I had to detail, under the cold, skeptical gaze of a lawyer, every broken promise, every lie, every dollar they had stolen. I recounted the shame of the bounced check and the terror of almost seeing my grandmother evicted. I laid my family's brokenness bare for a room full of strangers to dissect. But through it all, I held on to the truth. My voice never wavered. I was no longer the quiet girl on the ottoman. I was an archivist of facts, and the facts were on my side. In the end, the numbers did not lie. The jury found them guilty on multiple counts, including grand larceny and financial elder abuse. The judge, a stern woman who had looked at Richard and Jessica with open contempt throughout the trial, delivered a scathing sentencing. She spoke of the profound violation of trust and the vulnerability of the elderly. Richard was sentenced to 5 to 7 years in state prison. Jessica, deemed a slightly less active participant, received a sentence of 2 years. The civil court ordered the liquidation of all their assets to pay restitution to Agnes's estate. Their beautiful house was sold. Their luxury cars were auctioned off. Their carefully constructed world was dismantled, piece by piece. We never recovered all the money. Much of it had been lost in Richard's failed investments, vaporized into the ether of the real estate market. But we got enough back. After Ms. Reed's fees and the legal costs were paid, there was enough to ensure that Agnes could live out the rest of her days in comfort and security. I moved her to a new, smaller, but wonderfully kind and compassionate care facility closer to my apartment. The shadow of Maple Creek was gone. Here, the staff knew her name, her stories. They treated her with a gentle dignity that was more valuable than any fancy lobby. My life found a new rhythm. I worked at my archives, my sanctuary, and I spent my evenings with Agnes. I would read to her, we'd watch old movies, and sometimes we would just sit in comfortable silence, the bond between us reforged in the fires of betrayal and resilience. I never told her the full details of what Richard and Jessica had done. I only Aid that there had been a serious problem with her finances, but that I had fixed it, and she was safe now. She seemed to understand, on some level, what she did not need to know explicitly. She never asked about Richard or Jessica again. It was as if she, too, was archiving that part of her life away, filing it under a pain too deep to revisit. I am not the same person I was on that gray Sunday afternoon. The naive trust I once had in the simple concept of family is gone, replaced by a more cautious, clear-eyed understanding of people. I learned that loyalty and love are not guaranteed by blood. They are proven through actions, through sacrifice, through showing up when it matters. My family, as I once knew it, is destroyed. I have a brother in prison and a sister-in-law I will never speak to again. But in its place, something new has grown. My family is now Ms. Reed, who still calls to check in. It's the kind nurses who care for Agnes with such tenderness. It's the few old friends who stood by me, who brought me food when I was too exhausted to cook, who listened to me cry without judgment. I protected my grandmother. I stood up to the bullies in my life, and I won. I found my voice, not in a quiet archive of other people's stories, but in the loud, messy, and ultimately triumphant telling of my own. And for the first time in a very long time, my life is truly my own, preserved and protected by the very strength my family never thought I had.